How would you welcome death? As a friend? With a fight? Either way, it would be pointless. Death will take you, regardless. But from personal experience, sitting down and having a chat with dear Mr. Death may be the catalyst of the greatest adventure of your life. I was in my late 50s at the time of the story's beginning. Another night in the shop that I owned. We sold adventuring gear for the wary traveler. The wooden shelves smelled of age and light alcohol. We always kept trinkets and tools in the front for a quick grab. The alcohol and potions were kept further back, and of course the more valuable goods were kept behind the counter. I had built this shop in my 30s, about the same time my firstborn came into my life. The time had passed, and I was here, an old man working the night shift. But this night was different. The night was silent, not even the typical crickets chirping outside. The lanterns shone brightly enough, but flames could only pierce the darkness so far. Despite the weight that blanketed this night, I went to work cleaning everything, just as usual. Wood cleaner, oil, metal polish. The smell was always partially nauseating, but I had burned most of my smell away anyway. Although I clean and polish every night, and was quite accustomed to interruptions by the stray traveler, tonight was different. From the absolute void that was this winter night came some chirping. I thought it was odd, as I recognized them as canary calls. But as it was the dead of winter and the night, it was not so. I had tried to rationalize and wave the sound away as a squeaky wheel on a carriage or cart. But it was not long before he came in. A man in a dark, warm winter trench coat walked in without a word. The noise surrounded him, and chirping filled the room. It was not the clear and crisp chirping that I had heard before, but rather the chirping that sounded strangled and choppy. I put on the shopkeep face, as this was most definitely going to be a difficult customer, and I asked the man if he needed any help. He stared blankly with dark, beady eyes and even darker sockets, and spoke with a grating, whispery voice. "Have you ever been visited by a visage of death before?" You might expect that I was taken aback from such a question, and yet I only felt calm. I had lived a full life. I did not want to live until I was crippled by Father Time, only able to live when others held me and fed me, as if I were no more than a baby. I looked upon this mystery man without fear. I moved towards him and pulled 2 chairs out from behind the counter for us to sit on. I placed them amongst the walk space between the rope and rations section and sat down, motioning for the man to do the same. He stood for a minute longer and then accepted my invitation to sit. As he sat, his trench coat flared out and the chirping became louder. But this time, I saw why. There were shriveled, rotting bird corpses wheezing out unnatural chirps by necrotic means. Upon noticing that I saw the truth, the man smirked. "You wish to speak your way out of death. How typical of a species who fear the unknown." I smiled at that, for if he had visited before tonight, yesterday, the week before, years ago, I would have attempted to avoid death. Instead, I merely wished to talk. As calmly as I could, I asked, "How is it once you die? Anything spectacular or just a deep dive into absolute nothingness? The man stopped smirking and I watched the flesh, as gaunt as it was, melt off. His trench coat became whispers of shadow and smoke, the birds melting together into the shape of a scythe. As horrific as the sight was, it was also oddly fascinating. I believe I just saw a visage of death be consumed by death themselves, and so I stared death in their cold sockets, which was not as hard to do as people make it seem. Death pulled out an hourglass, told me to extend my hand, and then they set it upon my palm. It wasn't a large one, rather it was the size of my pinky finger. My name, etched in silver, shone on the base, and the inside of the hourglass was filled with black sand. I believe it to be important to point out that the lower half was the one filled with black sand. The top half barely had any left, and even what it did have was steadily dripping away. The skeleton grin of death is something I will never forget, and it was almost all I saw during this conversation. I talked to death as if it was an old friend, asking how they kept up with the demands, the morality of it all, how it is on the other side. For every question I asked, death replied calmly and starkly. I have visages do a lot of the work. I am not the one who kills. I arrive early, that way when the time runs out. Death extended a bony finger at the hourglass that was surely running out of sand. I am there to guide the newly deceased, nothing more. There are limits to even my knowledge. I spoke with death for hours, well into the night and almost into early morning. And as we talked, the sands drip, drip, dripped. And eventually death held up a hand and pointed at the hourglass. It was empty. My time was up. And yet my soul did not leave my body. I did not wither away. I could clearly feel my own heartbeat. I also heard a scraping, a harsh and grating sound that seemed too loud in this eerie quiet. It was only after I had examined myself to see just how alive I was that I realized it was death. They were laughing, I think. I have not had such an engaging conversation in eons, and truth be told, I did not come here to guide you to your next destination. Take this. They procured a metallic skull from their shadowy cloak and handed it to me. It was cold, heavy, and small, merely the size of a pea, with even smaller ruby gems where the eyes should be. Consider this a once-in-a-lifetime gift, or curse. As long as this is on your body, you will not die. If you wish to be released, just gouge out the rubies. I looked skeptically and asked, there must be more stipulations than that. What's the catch? Death at this point stared blankly, but I assumed that if he had muscle and flesh, he would have been smirking. If anyone else touches the totem, you both will die. It does not absolve you of harm, and you can be hurt irreparably. You can bleed, you can break, you can also be so vulnerably human. But despite the pain you may feel, you will never die. I sat there in silence, weighing my options. Before I could give Death an answer, they took the hourglass from me. My name, still shining in silver lettering, shone brighter than before, and as Death stowed the hourglass away, I noticed the sands had started to reverse. "My time has run out today, and it is best not to keep Father Time waiting," spoke Death. "Enjoy the gift." And Death reverted back into the visage it was before, a large, brawny man covered in a dark winter trench coat, with the sound of cursed canaries surrounding him. The visage walked out of the shop without a word, and I am sure if I attempted to find him after the shop door closed, I would not be able to. That is the thing with visages and Death themselves. They tend to disappear when they do not want to be seen. Once Death and his visage had left, I only had one thing to do. Finish cleaning. I pocketed the skull, moved the chairs back, and finished cleaning and polishing. A few minutes after I had finished polishing the shields, a knock came from the door. I actually had time to walk to the door and look through the slit this time. I looked through and was partially relieved and regrettably disappointed at who I saw. It was Everon, the boy who took the morning shifts. From sunrise until noon he mans the shop. Most would question why I would let one young man look over my shop alone, and to that I must inform you that he is honorable, kind, crafty, over 6 feet tall and built like a wall. But I went home, down the cobbled road, past the tavern, past the wizard Toltret's house. It was a shop and a tower and his house, and honestly the oddest building in the village. I went past and I went home. I unlocked the front door and walked straight to my bed. I never even changed into my nightgown. Unfortunately, I sleep through much of the day, and what goes on during the day, I know not. I awoke the following evening before I needed to go into work, and as I rolled out of bed, the skull rattled onto the floor, the rubies glimmering. I picked it up and took a closer look at the skull. Such a marvel, the skull. On the back there was a loop, perfect for a small chain. I rummaged through drawers in my bedroom until I found one. It was a thin, yet long, silver chain that worked just right. It would be a necklace I could never take off. The craftsmanship on the skull was otherworldly, although that was to be expected coming from Death themselves. The skull itself was made of iron, perfectly grafted, expertly quenched to increase its strength. The gems were precisely cut to emulate the shape and aesthetic of a human eye. There were smaller, darker rubies placed to look like pupils. A feat of craftsmanship that would sell for a not-so-small fortune, had this been any regular jewelry set. I found myself wondering who could have crafted this. After all, Death was not one to create. I was unaware of any crafting deities, so I figured it must have been Father Time itself, a being who creates and destroys without prejudice. I put the new necklace upon my neck and went about my chores for the day, some washing of dishes and suits, cooking my breakfast at the time most eat dinner, and feeding the stray cats. I had some pork and beans, nothing too special, and after all was said and done, I was off to another day, or rather night, at work. I listened, this time, for any and all sounds. There were crickets, my footsteps on the flagstones, and the occasional owl call. I thought that because of how normal it sounded, it would just be another night. It started just fine, a few more travelers than usual, but that was good. That means we got more gold, but supplies dwindled. Since I owned the place, I needed to keep inventory. What we sold that night was as follows: 5 bundles of rope with 5 gold each, 1 shield with 20 gold, a grand total of 23 healing potions, each worth 8 gold, and a full archer's set, worth 45 gold. In total, a profit of 274 gold. Quite a good haul, I will say. The usual in the shop is around 170 gold, so I was quite happy with myself. And that is how most of the night went. Busy, profitable, but pleasant. Around midnight things slowed down, which was typical. Most travelers went to the tavern or inn at this time of night, but that was not the case for that night, at least not for me. There was a short period where business slowed, and it naturally did not last long. Another man burst through the door, much like yesterday. Although this one was not nearly as big or burly, however, he was very death-like. He crashed through the door, stinking of rot, with grey skin. Upon closer inspection, the man's left arm looks like it had nearly been cleaved off. The arm flesh, a sickly green color, was hanging on only by a few tendons and the fibers of his shirt. Blood was pooling and trailing as the man stumbled towards me. I tried to help him, stabilize him, but he pushed past me with his good arm and reached for a bottle of mead. He popped the cork out with his teeth and poured the mead upon the wound. He then threw the bottle, which as a shopkeep I find it necessary to add that this was still half full at the point of shattering and worth 15 silver. Also a completely unnecessary mess I'd have to clean up later. The man pointed at his shoulder, which must have been stinging to high hell, and said, "Fire!" As soon as that word escaped his lips, an ember floated from his mouth onto his mead-soaked shoulder. Needless to say, it burst into flames. The almost severed arm became a truly severed arm. I had never seen someone burn themselves in a frenzy like that before. The man then turned to me and spoke in a language that I could not comprehend. The wounded arm, now severed by fire, did not seem to die, but rather I felt a tug from it. The man started to sag against the shelves, knocking over more merchandise. He had lost so much blood I was unsure if he was going to make it. And unfortunately, healing potions can't make more blood. On a whim, I decided to help the man and take him to the village wizard. I slung his good arm over my shoulder and carried his severed arm in my free hand, just in case Toltret would be able to heal and reattach the limb for this poor man. I closed up shop early and helped him hobble down the road to Toltret's shop. On the way, the man threw up a rancid, viscous liquid that seemed to burn the very air around it. He looked at me afterwards with fear in his eyes, and once again spoke words to me that I could not comprehend. I wish I had known how to speak his language then. I would have had my warning. But I did not understand him, nor did I understand why he stumbled away from me. A sheer look of horror and delirium on their face. I did not understand until I felt a hand wrap cold, dead fingers around my neck. I attempted to turn and see who my assailant was, and I was surprised, quite unpleasantly so, to see it was the very arm I had brought along. It was not too terribly hard to get off the frail, burnt thing, but it stank to high hell. After I ripped it away from me and my neck, I threw it on the ground, just as he had thrown the mead. But instead of shattering, the arm writhed and wriggled. It started to rot at an accelerated rate before my very eyes. Thorns pierced the skin from the inside out, causing devilish flowers to bloom and die within mere seconds. The arm rotted away to the point where even the bones were dusted away. I looked about for the man the arm came from, but the street was absolutely deserted. I looked back at where the arm was and saw the fingers were still intact, although shriveled. I do not know what came over me then, when I saw those fingers. I heard a whispering that seared my brain, words in a language I recognized but could not comprehend, repeating over and over, forcing my mind to go blank. Next thing I knew, I was consuming this rotten flesh. Me, a respected shopkeep, consuming humanoid rotting flesh in the middle of the street like some savage dog. The voices stopped as soon as the fingers were consumed. But that is when the pain started. A searing pain sharper and harder than the strikes of a blacksmith's hammer upon his anvil. A ripping sensation emanated from the inside of my chest, and I tore at it, my fingernails drawing blood as I sliced and clawed into my own skin. I must have blacked out from the pain at one point, as it was too unbearable. The pain, never ending, the heat, ever increasing. Images flashed in my mind, places I had never seen nor heard of, books and languages I did not know, people I could not recognize, no matter the torture. Even as I lay writhing and burning, just as the arm did before, I would not die. The skull shone from the within, proving its power to stop death. But what I was experiencing was worse than death. I wished to die in that moment, but could not move to gouge the rubies. I just could not die.